Oh. Are we going to wait till more people populate here a little bit?
Yeah, I think we can give folks a minute. And the chat is open now, so if folks want to say where they're from, feel free to put that in the chat.
Yeah. Feel free to, as Dan has mentioned, tell us where you're joining from. The chat is only going to be open for the first few minutes or so. Then we're going to close the chat during the presentations. And then after the presentations, we'll open up the conversation for questions, which you can put in the Q&A tab, which is located at the bottom of your screen. If you move your cursor around, you'll see it there. And we're recording. So if you're unable to stay for the entire event, we will be sharing the recording with all of our participants, and you're welcome to share the recording as well. Far and wide, we want a lot of people to learn all of this amazing information and very important information. Also, we're going to be keeping your mics muted and your cameras off. And this is intentional so that we keep our focus on our speakers. If you experience any technical issues, we have limited capacity while the webinar is running to try to assist you, but you can email Lena Fostel at lfaustel@gmail.com. Lena, can you put that in the chat real quick, please? And first up, we're 3 minutes in, so shall we go? Thumbs up? Okay. I'd really like to introduce, we're very lucky and thrilled to have Senator Pete Harckham, who's been a wonderful state senator here in New York. He's the 40th district, which is mostly Westchester and Putnam. And he's also been a sponsor of the bill in the Senate. And he was just elected chair of the the Conservation Committee. So Pete, welcome.
Janie, thank you so much. It's great to see you again. And to the Bedford Garden Club and the NRDC, thank you so much for this really important webinar. Just speaking in general, we really need in New York State to come to grips with the problems of pesticides, chemicals, and other toxins. The federal government does a horrendous job of regulating these chemicals. 80% of us have Roundup in our urine. We have over 125 chemicals identified in our system. Over 85% of our water bodies have been identified with PFAS chemicals. And so we're dealing with one tonight, which was one of the bad actors. It's easily identified and easily banned. And as you'll hear all the information from the experts tonight. So, I was a proud co-sponsor of this last year. I'm now the committee chair of NCON. It will come before our committee. We haven't even had our first organizational meeting. That'll come soon. So I don't want to get out ahead of my members and ahead of leadership. But I do want to assure you that pesticides, chemicals, and toxins are high on our radar as a conference, and high on my radar as an individual senator and as a chair. So I really want to thank you all so much for attending this seminar. Please get active, write your local officials, hold us accountable. Activism still works. Believe me, it works. Come up to Albany. It's your building. We work for you. Come on in and see us. But thanks again for attending, and thank you for all the presenters this evening. Good to see everyone.
Thank you so much, Senator. Thank you for joining us. And I didn't introduce myself, Janie Chase, my co-chair of Conservation and Civic Affairs for the Bedford Garden Club is Ellen Conrad. She's here with us. And our zone representative for Conservation and Civic Affairs and National Affairs is Joy Flynn. She's also on screen. We're gonna be stepping aside here so that our presenters, our real hosts, Dan Raichel and Kathy Nolan, Dr. Kathy Nolan, can show you their presentation. And afterwards, again, we'll have Q&A. You can put your questions in the Q&A. And if you go into the chat, we're going to close it down soon, but you're welcome to put where you're from in the chat. And I say, take it away, Dan and Dr. Kathy.
So I will attempt to share my screen here. Hopefully I can do that easy enough. And do folks see that?
Yes.
Excellent. Janie, thank you so much. And thank you to the whole Bedford Garden Club. Yeah, as mentioned, my name is Dan Raichel. I'm acting director of NRDC's pollinator initiative, and here today to talk a little bit about neonic pesticides, why they're so bad for bees, birds, ecosystems, and our own health. And I'm just going to echo Janie's thanks too as well for Senator Harcum. Senator Harcum was one of the first sponsors on the previous session's Birds and Bees Protection Act, and we're just so grateful for his support and so excited that he's here tonight. So jumping right into things, our entrance into this issue started with the humble honeybee. So I think as folks on this call probably know, bees and other pollinators are very important. 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we eat come from pollination provided by bees and other pollinators. And to give you a sense of what that looks like in your grocery aisle, this is what that aisle looks like in a world with bees, the world that we currently live in. And here's what that grocery aisle looks like if we lost our bees and other pollinators. So certainly we would still have food. We would just have a lot less of it. We would lose a lot of our most delicious and nutritious options. And all of it would be a lot more expensive, which I think in a time of inflation is something that's a concern for everyone. Beyond the grocery store aisle, bees are absolutely critical to ecosystems. So 80% of the plants on the face of the earth require bees or other pollinators to reproduce. So if we lose bees and other pollinators, we worry not only about food security, but also the collapse of ecosystems. And that's basically what we're worried about. So in the mid-2000s, beekeepers in New York and across the country saw their losses of honeybee colonies suddenly start to shoot through the roof. Up until that point, they were losing maybe 10, 15% a year, mostly to winter cold. And those numbers became 40, 50% virtually overnight. And folks were losing their bee colonies year round, right? So something new was going on. And unfortunately, those losses from about 2006, 2007 have persisted to this day at record levels and have just become the new and terrible normal. Now, honeybees are not native to New York or the US, and they're livestock. So when beekeepers lose bees, there's a whole system for breeding and replacing those colonies. So bee colonies remain constant, even though it takes more and more furious efforts to replace those bees. Our native pollinators, bees, butterflies, etc., are not so lucky. And this is from a report that just came out from the New York Natural Heritage Program that's state funded, and found that 40 to 60% of the native pollinators in New York are at risk of local extinction, or also known as extirpation. And that's not a problem just for New York ecosystems. Again, bees are really important for food production. This comes from a study finding across the US that apples, blueberries, and cherries were pollinator limited nationwide. What this means is apple farmers would grow more apples, same for blueberries, cherries, if there were more bees, and in particular, wild bees. So, honeybees are important pollinators, but we need those wild bees too, especially when it comes to some of these top crops in New York. And actually, I just saw a new study that came out just last month that found similar things worldwide. Fruit production about 5% down because we just don't have enough pollinators. So why are we so worried about this particular class of pesticides? Because bees are facing a lot of problems. There's climate change, there's habitat loss, there's parasites, pathogens. There are a number of issues affecting bees beyond pesticides. So why pesticides and why neonics in particular? Well, initially, it's helpful to know what neonics are. So neonics are neurotoxic insecticides, which means they are pesticides designed to kill bugs by attacking their nerves. And what they do is they attach to those nerve sites, those nerve cells, and they stimulate the nerve, overstimulate it until it eventually fails. So if you see a bee that has been acutely poisoned with neonics, oftentimes that bee will start to twitch uncontrollably, right as his nerves fire. And then eventually that bee will become paralyzed and die. But I think as Senator Harcum pointed out, there are a lot of pesticides out there, a lot of toxic chemicals. A lot of them kill bees and other insects in gruesome ways. So why neonics? There are three big reasons. The first is that neonics are super duper toxic to bees and other insects. And to give you a sense of scale here, just one neonic treated corn seed is enough active ingredient to kill 250,000 bees or more. And in fact, neonics have made US agriculture 48 times more harmful to insect life since their introduction. And here's where I'm going to bring your attention to. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but if you see where that harmfulness starts to spike up, it's almost exactly at the time when we see that sudden spike in losses of honeybees. And again, there are a lot of other problems. None of them match that spike that we see with honeybees in the mid-2000s, except for the uptick in use in neonics, in particular on corn and soybean seeds. Second problem with neonics is that they are really good at contaminating the whole environment. So they are designed to permeate plants, to get into the leaves, the roots, the pollen, the nectar, everything, and effectively to make the plant itself toxic, to make the plant itself the pesticide. And that means they can be applied in all sorts of interesting ways. Of course, they can be sprayed, and they often are, but more commonly, they're applied directly to soil or literally painted on a crop seed. And here's a picture of some neonic treated corn seed. Here's a close-up of some treated corn seed. They don't always pick the same color. And the idea is that as that seed is growing, it literally soaks up the pesticide coating through its roots and becomes toxic. The problem is only 2 to 5% of that coating actually make it into the target plant. The other 95+% stays in the environment. A lot of it is released as, in these clouds of toxic dust during planting, but the vast majority stays in the soil. And there it remains for years and years and years. And those same properties that let it get up into the plant, namely its water solubility or its ability to dissolve in water, means that anytime it rains, those neonics are moving through the soil, they're contaminating new soil. If there are plants in that soil, those plants soak up the neonics, they become toxic, their pollen, their nectar. If there's a water supply nearby, the water supply becomes contaminated. The third issue with neonics is that they are just so darn popular. They're the most popular insecticides in the United States, most used, and virtually all conventional corn seed is pre-treated with a neonic before planting. So that's 1 million acres in New York. That's joined by probably several 100,000 acres of treated soybeans in New York. But off the farm, neonics are all over lawns, gardens, golf courses, you name it. And actually in those landscapes, they're approved at much higher rates per acre. So we know in New York, neonic use has gone up and up and up, and I'll bring folks' attention to this red square here. That's the use of imidacloprid, just one of 5 EPA-approved neonics, and as you note, not even the most used in New York. And this is a map of imidacloprid use across the US in agriculture. I know 2014 is not super duper recent, but it's the most recent year that we have data for the use of seeds, which is the biggest use. But what so one other thing a couple of things to note here. Again, this is just imidacloprid. This is just one of 5 neonics. It's not even the most used neonic in New York. And this is just agricultural use. So a lot of those white areas around Long Island and Westchester and up the Hudson Valley would be filled in if it was tracking that non-ag use, or might be filled in if it was tracking the uses of those other neonics. But what this does give you a sense of is that these pesticides are used over vast areas year after year after year. And because they persist in the ground for years, you have a buildup of toxicity over time that is constantly spreading out every time it rains, every time there's irrigation or lawn watering, contaminating new soil, new water, and plant life. And what that has led to is virtually ubiquitous contamination over huge portions of New York and across the country. So we definitely see this in New York water. Neonics are all over New York surface waters. They're the most commonly detected insecticide in the Long Island aquifer. And almost all of the levels detected are above EPA's benchmark levels for harms to aquatic ecosystems. So they are likely causing ecosystem-wide damage. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. And one thing to note is most of the results, most of the testing is just looking at imidacloprid, again, just that one. So as bad as it looks, what we're seeing, the picture we're seeing from the testing is likely a big underestimate. And it's worth noting too here that conventional chlorination treatment generally fails to remove neonics from water supplies. Advanced filtration does, but very few systems use that. So that's the contamination picture. What effect is that having? Well, the first that we know of, and the canary in the coal mine here, are neonics are decimating our bee populations. That is absolutely clear from the scientific literature. But if you think about it, having whole ecosystems contaminated with a highly toxic insecticide probably has a bigger effect than just that. And the effect, I think, where people see it most is sort of the windscreen test, or the windshield test, as folks call it. And for those on the call who remember the mid-1990s, imagine driving through a rural area at that time in the middle of summer. You would have to turn on your windshield wipers, whether it was raining or not, just to get all the bugs off of your windshield. And when was the last time you had to do that? And that's the effect that we're talking about. We are seeing a huge hollowing out of our environment from the bottom up. Bees sort of were our indicator species, but it's much bigger than that. And that ripples up to other species too. I know not everybody loves insects, but as it turns out, birds love insects. And so we see the use of neonics associated with mass losses of birds and bird biodiversity. Some folks on the phone may remember a study from Cornell Lab of Ornithology that came out a couple of years ago, finding 30% bird losses in North America over the last 50 years. A couple of scientists came in after that study and looked at the results. And they contrasted birds where insects were essential to their diet versus birds that didn't need insects as an essential part of their diet. As it turns out, the birds that didn't need insects are kind of doing okay. Maybe some losses for a few species, but for the most part actually gained in numbers. But the birds that rely on insects are getting hammered. And a good part of that is because they just don't have the food. Same thing happens with fish. So this is a study out of Japan, some researchers looking at zooplankton. And for those who don't know what zooplankton is, here's a picture of some zooplankton, water bugs or water invertebrates. And what they noticed is that in the mid-90s or the early 90s, zooplankton just sort of hit a wall. And at the same time, in that fishery, the catches of fish that ate the zooplankton also hit a wall, likely because they had no more food. And researchers later connected it to the introduction of neonics in nearby agriculture. This is one of the first uses of neonics in the world. And it's worth noting that the neonic levels they measured there later match levels that we see in New York all the time. And these are really, really small levels, like parts per trillion. So I'm going to pass it off to Kathy in a bit and move into direct impacts, because it's not just invertebrates, right? Animals without spines that are affected. It's also us spine-having animals. And, starting with birds, one neonic-treated seed, corn seed, has enough active ingredient to kill a small songbird. And we know that birds eat these seeds at time of planting. There's, there's a lot of observations on that birds, they like to eat seeds, and during the spring planting, they eat a lot of them. And even where ingestion of a seed wouldn't kill a bird outright, these seeds interfere with birds' neurological well-being, so they can interfere with navigation, with the ability to fly and find food. This is a study showing that birds that ate these seeds started to lose weight rapidly during a time of migration, which is a really problematic thing. Neonics have been linked to reproductive harms, to harms to the immune system. So even if that exposure, whether it's eating a seed or somehow otherwise coming in contact or drinking contaminated water, even if that doesn't immediately kill the bird, it can ultimately lead to that bird's demise in the wild, or demise of the population to the extent it affects reproduction. And here's where I'll turn it over to Kathy, who's going to talk a little bit about mammals, including us.
Thank you, Dan. I'm Kathy Nolan. I'm a pediatrician. I'm currently president of the Physicians for Social Responsibility chapter in New York. And I've spent the last few decades of my life looking at environmental and public health issues. The reason that I'm very concerned about neonicotinoid insecticides is that, as Dan has been showing, they're toxic, and this really shouldn't surprise us. I've put up the chemical structure of nicotine at the top, and then 2 neonicotinoid agents beneath that. And the word neonicotinoid means new nicotine-like substance. So nicotine is a powerful neurotoxin, and with this much in common in the chemical structure, it's not surprising that we're seeing these neonicotinoids being really terrible toxins as well. Maybe we can go to the next slide. So this headline from Scientific American in 2019 says, as pesticide turns up in more places, safety concerns mount. And the subhead is, a growing body of research is challenging the assumption that neonicotinoids are safer and less likely to spread than other pesticides. Well, those of us who look at chemical structure and toxicology would never have thought that neonicotinoids were going to be safer, or that they were going to be less likely to spread. They are less likely to spread in the air and in dust, in chemical applications, if you paint them on these seeds. But then what happens is the chemical goes into the water and into the food. So they spread, but they're just spreading invisibly. We don't see them as much. The next slide. So we should be very concerned when we see birds and other animals that are feeling the toxicity of these insecticides. The birds and the fish may have their food source removed, but it also looks like they had direct toxic effects. And it turns out that everywhere I've looked, anything that is treated with neonicotinoids, it is either injured or killed. When we started to see problems in a large mammal, that became particularly concerning, because mammals are what are used to study the harmful effects of compounds like medicines. And if they're animal models for potential human harmful effects. So what happened in 2019 is that hunters in Montana started reporting to their field service agents that they were seeing abnormal jaws in deers and abnormal genitalia. So a group of researchers in South Dakota captured and put deer in pens and fed them with neonicotinoids in water so they could control the dose that the deer were receiving. There were a couple of things that this study showed. One was when they tested the deer that had not yet had any of the treated water, they already had neonicotinoids in their bloodstream. So there was no real control of deer, even in the wild, that weren't showing neonicotinoids in their blood. And the researchers showed decreased survival, activity, size of fawns, and health, which they believe was due to immune suppression. And they saw that the chemicals were accumulating in the body organs of the adult deer. Let's go to the next slide. What was very troubling in terms of, again, an animal model, a mammal that might be thought to have similar effects as other mammals, such as humans, is that the researchers did show that in these treated deer, that the offspring, the fawns, had congenital deformations of their jaw. They had decreased body and organ weight, and they had hypothyroidism and lethargy, and a lot of the fawns died. The decreased body weight and organ weight means lack of health, but the congenital malformations are particularly worrisome, because when we see that in an animal model, we become concerned that you might also see that in humans. And the incidence of those jaw deformities was dose related. So at the lower doses, you saw a smaller number of congenital abnormalities. And as the dose increased, the number of problems in the fawns also increased, which is considered to start to move into the realm of establishing a causal relationship between the agent you're providing and those outcomes. The researchers also just studied how widely you could find neonics in deer, in the blood and urine and in these body organs. And in 2019, 61% of deer they studied were shown to have neonics, and nearly a third were above the levels that were associated with those birth defects. By 2021, they were finding neonics in 94% of deer. And these are deer in the wild, but perhaps exposed to corn crops or corn seed. Not clear how they're getting this exposure, but 94% exposed and 64% at levels that had been associated with those higher rates of birth defects and death. So what does this mean for people? Well, it's very troubling if you think in terms of patterns that help us predict what we might find in humans. Neonicotinoids give acute toxicity if humans encounter them, that's very similar to nicotine poisoning. And there are studies that are called case control studies, where a group that's been exposed is compared with a group that hasn't been exposed. And those studies allow us to look at chronic exposures. Those studies are very troubling and have been said to have what are called suggestive findings. 4 of these studies reported associations between chronic neonic exposures and adverse development or neurological outcomes, including tetralogy of Fallot, which is a congenital heart malformation, anencephaly, which is a horrible brain abnormality in which the brain doesn't form in fetal life above the brainstem, autism spectrum disorder, and a symptom cluster that involved memory loss and finger tremor. Again, symptoms that could be seen with acute nicotine poisoning or chronic nicotine exposure. So let's go to the next slide. We would look at that a little bit closer. The Centers for Disease Control finds that half of Americans are exposed to neonics on any given day. That was in 2016. In 2022, a study of 171 pregnant women found 94% of the pregnant women were exposed. And their study was done from 2017 to 2020. And over the course of those years, the number of women that were found to have neonics increased, and the levels in their bloodstream also were found to increase. Their highest levels and the higher rates of finding neonics were associated with non-white Hispanic women, also non-white women in general, but most noticeably, most dramatically in Hispanic women. So again, we have case control studies, which are preliminary. You cannot do studies ethically in which you administer neonics to a group and then not to another group and study them. But the kinds of outcomes that we're seeing, birth defects in the heart and brain, autism-like symptoms, in adults, you can see decreased sperm quantity and quality. And again, in adults, decreased testosterone, altered insulin regulation, changes in fat metabolism. These are changes in adult function that are associated with what are called endocrine disruptive compounds. And the toxicology, again, of these neonics leads us to think that that may be a mechanism by which the agents are causing or could be linked with congenital abnormalities and with changes in neurologic function in developing infants and children. My colleague, Dr. Phil Landrigan, has analogized what's happening with the neonics to what had been happening with the lead industry, where medicine learned that there was that there were harmful effects at very, very low levels of exposure to lead, and that there was no such thing as a safe lead level that a child could have. So we had the beginning of a silent lead poisoning epidemic. And we finally understood that as we saw these problems, decreased intelligence levels, shortening attention span, disrupted behavior, that the exposure to lead was a key element. And this led to changes in regulations in terms of lead in gasoline and other efforts to interrupt lead exposure, which has decreased the number of children that are suffering these harmful effects from exposure. We haven't yet taken the same kind of definitive steps in relationship to neonicotinoids. And yet I think we have a picture that should be leading us to interrupt now these agents, when used on seeds and used in agriculture, remain in the soil for years, and some of them probably up to decades, but they do break down. And so if we stop using them, it is possible to let them come out of the soil and let them stop getting into our water and our food and protect ourselves and our children. So I'll hand it back over to you at this point, Dan. There's a couple of questions already coming into the chat that I think you're going to address, and if not, we'll get to them in the question and answer period.
Yeah, definitely. We'll get to folks' questions at the end, but thank you, Kathy. That was a really a great summary of the problem here. And now that we know the problem with neonics and the concerns, what are folks doing about that? And, you know, first, we look across the world, and the European Union in 2018 banned essentially all outdoor uses of the 3 major neonics chemicals used over there. And just across the border in Canada, Quebec and Ontario have taken measures to really restrict the use of neonic treated corn and soybean seed. And that I've just seen the numbers on that. They're essentially not using neonics on corn in Quebec anymore. France has taken some broader measures, but here in the United States, and I think Senator Harckham said it really well, EPA does a lousy job of protecting us from the harms of pesticides. And that's true in regardless of administration, right? The last EPA decisions we have on neonics did come out during the Trump administration. They essentially allowed neonics to continue sort of business as normal. And while EPA is revisiting that opinion and may issue some new proposed decisions this spring, we're not holding our breath because, over decades, and regardless of whether it was a Democrat or Republican in the White House, EPA has really not done a great job with its pesticide approvals from a protection standpoint. So that leaves it up to the states. And a number of states have already taken action. New Jersey and Maine are sort of the leaders on this. They recently banned non-agricultural neonic uses. And in those states, those non-agricultural lawn and garden uses account for most of the neonic use there. A number of other states have taken action, and that includes most recently New York, to limit neonic use to certified professionals, and that's listing them as restricted use pesticides. The problem there is that does not affect the use of neonic treated seeds, which we know is the largest and most widespread use. And it also doesn't affect uses by landscapers or pest control specialists. And we know those are huge uses too. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the problem with neonics is not that people are misusing them, right? That they're not following the labels. The problem is that the labels allow destruction of the environment and threats to our health. So that brings us to the Birds and Bees Protection Act. And this is an act that is based on a report by Cornell University where the authors looked at over 1,100 peer-reviewed studies, basically everything that had been written on neonics and pollinators to that date. And the key thing is that the study did a cost-benefit analysis, neonics versus their likely alternatives, were they to disappear? Because the key question we asked with pesticides is, both, are they bad? But secondly, okay, if they're bad and we get rid of them, what's going to replace them? And is that going to be worse? And that's an important question. And there were two things that report found. The first is that the neonic treated corn, soybean, and wheat seeds, while posing big risks to pollinators, and we know ecosystems and water contamination, et cetera, provided no overall net income benefit to farmers. So the largest use in New York State, the most widespread use, not providing economic benefits. And to break that down a little bit more, very rarely would you see a yield benefit, but even when you did, the extra cost of having the pesticide on the seed, when you compared that to the benefit, it was a wash. So that makes them, the largest and most unjustifiable use of the pesticides in the state. Similarly, on lawn and garden uses, turf and ornamental uses, and this is, I think, especially relevant to this group, what the study found is in 80+% of cases, neonics were being used prophylactically, sort of like taking an antibiotic just in case you might get sick, and wastefully, right? Treating problems that didn't really exist. And even in those other cases where you might want to use an insecticide, there were a number of safer alternatives, effective alternatives available. So the Birds and Bees Protection Act just addresses those two uses. It prohibits those two uses. And that accounts for about 80 to 90% of the neonics going into New York's environment. So these high cost, low benefit uses, these dumb uses, are most of the problem. And you know, the bill has also some exceptions. You know, there exceptions for invasive species treatment, which are not included. There's ways to relax the ban, but to give folks a sense of how narrow this bill is when it comes to agriculture, it really just affects those neonic treated corn, soybean, and wheat seeds. So if a farmer wanted to plant a non-neonic treated corn seed and at the same time apply a neonic, that farmer would still be able to do so, right? Of course, we know they wouldn't do that because, as the studies show, that doesn't provide them any value. But the problem with the seeds is that the farmers, sometimes by choice and sometimes they're just forced to, by the sort of monopolistic power of the seed and chemical companies, purchase the meal deal, right? It's the seed with the chemicals already on it. And we want to break apart that meal deal because it's not providing farmers any good, and it's really harming the environment and putting our health at risk. So what happened with the bill last session? It passed in the Assembly by a supermajority vote. Unfortunately, we ran out of time in the Senate. It did get to the Senate floor, but just didn't get a vote before time ran out. We know that a very similar bill there, or the earlier version of the bill, passed in 2021 by a supermajority vote again. So it's actually passed in both houses, just not the same year. Unfortunately, legislation is not horseshoes, but we're hopeful that this year we'll get it in both houses, and we have a lot of support this year, a lot of momentum, and we're optimistic. So here's the slide that may be the most important. How can you get involved? And I think at the top of the list, we're going to put the 2 lobby days that we have. We have a virtual lobby day coming up on Tuesday, the 24th. And essentially what that is, and everybody here already knows how to get on Zoom or a video call. It's essentially a series of video calls led by a team leader. Usually there's a team of folks, 3 to 5 people that speak with a particular office or their staff. And the good thing about the virtual world is you can come to as many or few meetings as you would like. We also have an in-person lobby day that we're planning. It's not yet set in stone, for February 15th, although I was informed that's a particularly bad day for the Bedford Garden Club. So we'll look at that. But we will have in-person lobby days in Albany, which is a little bit more of a commitment. You can't just Zoom in and Zoom out. But we're always looking to have folks come. As Senator Harcum said, it's your house up there. And legislators do like to hear from constituents. We have sign-on letters. We're going to have a petition for individuals. We also have a coalition letter. We sent a version of it out this week, but we're still accepting signatures on it from organizations. So if you know of organizations that might be interested in signing, please reach out to us. There's that opportunity available. Obviously, contacting your legislators outside of a lobby day is always great in support of the bill. It really does make a difference. And email is great, but a phone call is usually better. There's opportunities to write an op-ed or a letter to the editor in your local paper, and we have guides on that for folks who might be interested. And then, of course, there's other opportunities, social media and beyond. And if you are interested in any of this, please reach out to Lena, and there's her email address, and we'll also send out some information on that. And with that, I think we will go to questions.
Great. There have been a lot of really excellent questions in the Q&A, and I didn't see any that we shouldn't answer live. I think we started in on a few of them, but are you going to read those for us, Janie, or?
Sure. Carol McPeak asks, who's in control of the supply of crop seed, which presumably is treated, and do farmers have options to acquire non-treated seed? And
so that's a very good question, and it sort of depends. So certainly for soybeans and wheat, there is untreated seed available. With corn, it's a little trickier, again, because of the monopoly or oligopoly power of the seed and chemical corporations. And what I mean by that is, right now, the people that make the seeds are also the people that make the chemicals. And you might find some familiar names there. Bayer, Monsanto just merged recently, but there's also Dow DuPont, which is now Corteva, and well, Syngenta, you might not recognize that name. But so because of that, it can be difficult to find conventional corn seed that is not treated with a neonic. But what we know is that anytime restrictions have been put on these seed treatments, the market has opened up. And there was a hearing in the assembly in 2021 on this issue, and a couple of seed dealers testified on the bill. There was a seed dealer in support of restrictions and a seed dealer, against. But even the seed dealer supporting restrictions noted that New York has a $100 million corn market, and that if there were any seed dealer or corporation in the world that would walk away from a $100 million market, he doesn't know them. And then for the seed dealer testifying against restrictions, when pressed in questions, they said, how long would it take for the markets to adjust? And he said, about 2-3 years. And that in the bill, the provision prohibiting the seed treatments doesn't take effect until 3 years after the bill would pass. So that's built into the bill. And I should also note too, that the bill has safeguards if that seed is not commercially available. If the purchase of untreated seed would cause undue financial hardship for farmers, that ban gets relaxed. And although that seems sort of like a loose standard, right? You would assume it might get abused. In Quebec, we saw recently a law there that said farmers, it didn't prohibit neonic treated seeds. It says farmers can use the seed if they get a note from their agronomist saying they need it, which is about the easiest thing to do. And regardless of that, we saw neonic levels go from in 2015, 100% of corn in Quebec was neonic treated. By 2019, that number was 2%. And by 2020, it was 0.2%. So markets don't like uncertainty, and we think that this bill will send a market signal and the markets will respond.
Maybe we could also address, there were a couple of related questions about whether brightly colored seed in lawn stores for grass seed, I guess, is neonic treated grass seed. And my answer is, I think it could be. I think that the use of these special colors is a mechanism to indicate that you're not supposed to eat those seeds. So seeing that, I think it's likely, but I don't know. Dan, do you have a thought?
So that's correct. Under federal law, if you put a pesticide on a seed, you have to colorize it so that folks know, hey, there's a pesticide on the seed. And so, we get this question about seed generally. If the seed just looks natural, don't worry, it doesn't have a neonic on it. If it is colorized, maybe, and you would need to look at the bag for that product and what it contains or doesn't contain. And unfortunately, neonics are a class of chemicals. So you would have to know what the specific neonic chemicals are and then look for those chemicals on the seed. I'm sorry that it's that difficult, although there are only 3 neonic chemicals that are common seed treatments.
Wow. Should we go to, I am not going to be able to pronounce Julie's last name properly, so I'm not going to try, but there's a question from Julie S. Are advanced filtration systems used widely in homes Is there a difference if you are on well water compared to city water?
Yes. So what I should note first is, and I don't know if we have any folks from New York City and Syracuse, both of those water supplies are famously unfiltered, right? They have an avoidance determination from EPA. They are chlorine treated, but they're not filtered. So if you live in those areas or drink water in those areas, to the extent the source water is contaminated, it's not getting filtered out. For most other systems, and this may be, I think Long Island might be one of the places that uses some more advanced filtration, just because they have for years had problems with pesticide contamination of their aquifer, but most systems don't use what removes them with granular active carbon filtration. I've talked with my water department about this. They don't have exact numbers nationwide, but maybe 10% of systems use it. And if you're pulling groundwater, I mean, you would know if you had a system or not, right? If you have a granular active carbon filter, maybe if you're using reverse osmosis, those would remove the neonics. But most folks, I think, who are pulling from groundwater don't use those sorts of systems.
And this raises an issue that I didn't speak about, but there's a social justice issue here, because people who can afford to put those filtration systems on their water can remove these chemicals. Those individuals who can't afford those systems don't have that option. And it's very similar in regard to neonic exposure through the food chain. Organic foods have much lower levels of neonics and other contaminants in them than do conventionally, what is now conventional, industrialized food. And so individuals who have less access to an organic food in their neighborhood are going to have higher exposures. And it doesn't seem right to me that individuals who are already struggling, maybe from a socioeconomic point of view, now have the problem that they have this additional exposure. So we should remove the exposure. I mean, it's just unreasonable to have nicotine-like substances in our food and our water. We need to remove that for everybody. And the way to do that is to remove these treated seeds, which are basically leaching out of the agricultural fields into the groundwaters and into the surface waters that may be used as a drinking water source. So there was another question in the chat about, how would you have exposure in Westchester? And I don't know the levels of exposure there, but there are exposures through some of these non-agricultural uses, and that's why some of them are included in the bill as well. In New Jersey, which did just pass regulations to limit some of the non-agricultural uses, that was the main source of their exposure that they were trying to address. We want to address both, but the majority of the neonics in the system in New York State are coming from these agricultural uses.
And those are all really good points, Kathy. And I think just on the non-agricultural side, again, even though those are much less geographically spread out, the rates of application are much higher in those settings. So, and the approved rates are sometimes, 20, 100 times as high as what's approved for an equivalent agricultural use. And of course, we know that folks aren't always good about reading the labels, and they may use even more than that. And these are areas where, you have big concentrations of people, where that's happening near source water. And in fact, I don't know specific to New York, but I know for certain in New Jersey, folks were actually seeing more contamination of water in urban areas than in agricultural areas.
And that's probably from plants that are being brought into homes and into yards. Do we know for sure where?
I think it's That's part of it, but I think it's mostly just the, you know, the products, and people slip neonics into home products too. So if you buy a fertilizer that says it also kills bugs or gets rid of pests, chances are that fertilizer has a neonic in it. If you are buying these 3-in-1 products, you know, feeds your rose garden, but also controls pests, those typically contain neonics in them. So they get snuck in all sorts of ways. And of course, there's just, you know, your typical lawn treatments, your insecticide treatments. They used to be sold, the big popular one used to be Bayer Advanced, which I think is Bio Advanced. There's Merit, but they're actually out of patent now, the neonic chemicals. So there are many different folks that manufacture them.
Wow. There are a couple of comments that saying that their neonics can be purchased on Amazon by
Yes.
New York, by homeowners.
Well, what can't you purchase on Amazon, right?
Yeah, it's really horrible. And I think Jenny Lee, who may be Jenny Lee in the legislative district that I represent in Ulster County, has put a link in the Q&A to ways to try to influence Amazon to stop making these chemicals so widely available. And also, I think this is one of the roles that garden clubs and, you know, we can all take up to educate the public. Because if we do get when we do get the Birds and Bees Protection Act passed, we don't want people reaching out and bringing these chemicals into their home. I mean, and paying somebody. I mean, it's like paying somebody to poison you. Don't do it.
Yeah. Wow. I know I was activated early on because my father grew up in agricultural part of California, sort of central California. And he was born in 1925 and we started using chemicals in the 40s. So when he was in his 20s, a neighboring farmer went out and spread a bunch of chemicals that he thought he was doing a good thing on his crops. And he had a can of Coca-Cola or something, and he was drinking it and spraying the chemicals and drinking, and he got horribly sick and died very quickly, like within days. And my father saw that happening. And so that was very eye-opening for me as a child to hear it. So I've tried to buy organic and support organic as much as possible. This is real. These chemicals kill. That's the point.
Yeah, that's the acute toxicity that should give us real pause about the likelihood of chronic toxicity. You know, something that has the ability to actually kill a grown human being from the amount that's in a can of soda is a powerful substance that, you know, we shouldn't be taking in even in small doses regularly over time. Yeah.
Yeah. And thank you so much, Dr. Nolan, for bringing up the environmental and social injustice behind all of this. That is so important. It is not okay for those of us who, you know, oh, I can protect my family, and we should do that. But we need to think about people who don't have the ability to escape it.
Even for people who can afford the systems, we have this irrational aspect here where the farmers pay more for treated seed that they don't need because the crops grow fine without the treatment. And then the consumer pays more for the treated food. And then you have to buy a system and pay for a system to take those chemicals off the food. So at each step along the way, we're allowing the chemical industry to, you know, force the hand of each of us along in the system. And that's where we have to, as a public, communities, take back that power and not allow them to make the system be so irrational in that way, and really harm us financially as well as potentially harming our health. So there was a question in the chat that I wanted to make sure that we answered because it was well put. It says, I have read the proposed Birds and Bees Protection Act. There is no allowance for invasives that I can see. What am I missing? And this is a problem that we've had with people in the world of treating invasive species in New York State have had the same question. And maybe we need to address it in the way we frame the language, Dan. But what it is that because the Act only says you can't put these treatments on seeds, it has nothing to do with invasives. So we didn't specifically say you can use this for invasives.
Well, there is a prohibition on those non-agricultural uses. So that prohibition first is limited to turf and ornamental uses. So the way that's crafted, it shouldn't affect forestry uses, which DEC actually considers a separate type of use. Although there may be some ornamental trees that folks want to treat. And so there is an emergency exemption provision, and the way it's written, it could apply broadly to hemlock woolly adelgid. It could apply to, emerald ash borer, spotted lanternfly, any of these invasive species that we know are really harmful to New York's trees. A lot of the invasive species are wood-boring insects, and as opposed to seeds, which you put in the ground, the neonics are actually either put at the base of the tree or injected into the tree. And so, look, pollinators go to trees, people eat fruit and stuff off of trees, so it's not without certain risks, but it's a much more contained use. And we've worked to, we've talked with folks in the invasive species industry on language that is broad enough to address any of the threats and isn't sort of cabined. I know it doesn't say invasive specifically, but we didn't want to cabin it to any specific invasive species because you never know what might arise. So, yeah.
Since 80 to 90% of the neonics come from these other uses, we felt that we didn't have to try to have an across the board ban. And we hoped that that compromise would lead to a broader level of support. And it has, I think that there are people that recognize that. What we haven't seen yet is farmers who really should be in favor of this bill because it protects their pollinators. But we haven't seen farmers coming forward as strong advocates. And so it'd be, it's wonderful to have the garden clubs doing that because I think in some ways that's kind of a link to the agricultural world. People who recognize plants and what it takes to, have them flourish. I think you speak with an authority on this that's really helpful to have coming into the Assembly and Senate in support of this bill.
Well, and it's worth noting too that the organic farmers have been partners on NOFA New York has long been a partner on the bill. And I know a lot of farmers individually, conventional farmers are also in support. Sometimes there's a disconnect between the folks representing you in Albany and you. And I think that's happening with some of the farming community as well. But I know we're a little bit over time. So Janie, I would defer to you whether we should keep talking here.
Well, we seem to have answered the questions in the Q&A and very well, I might add. Thank you so much to both of you, Dan and Kathy. And I just want to encourage anyone else who's still on, if you want to quickly jump in, you may, but share this recording. We will get it to you tomorrow and spread it out there. If you know someone who is a farmer or someone who knows someone who's growing, share it and share it with we need to stand up, and speak out and take care of ourselves and one another. It's our responsibility to do that, to sit back and and not do it is really sad, and it leads to a bleak future for all of us. So we can make it better.
Dan, did
Yes.
you want to make any mention about the lobbying day?
Oh, he did. He talked about the 24th being virtual. We're going to send that information on tomorrow as well, and with the link to the recording. And February 15th in person might stick, or it might get changed. So we're going to try to look into that.
My very gracious hosts, I can't thank you both enough, both Ellen and Janie, for arranging this with the Bedford Garden Club, and for Dan and Dr. Nolan for being so cooperative with us and guiding us and leading us over the years now. So we're bringing this over the finish line with you, and I want to thank all the Garden Club audience that are here tonight. So many, many thanks to you all.
Well, here, I will echo those hearty thanks to Janie and Ellen and the club, and also Senator Harcum, who I saw had to jump. But it's been such a pleasure. Thank you all for inviting us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go lobby.
All right.
Don't
All right.
forget also to write and call.
Write
your
and call.
representatives. And they will be
Exactly. Thank
sending
you.
you a link to be able to do that very quickly. But we want to flood these legislators with information and concerns about this problem so that they will get this legislation passed.
Yes. So write and call. Here we go. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.